A no-deal Brexit would see the UK leave the EU immediately. There would be no transition period, and the relationship between the EU and the UK left undefined. Overnight, the laws that set out how businesses trade, how people and goods move across Europe would cease to exist. So how exactly would a no-deal affect you? Let's talk first about the things you buy. The UK grows around 2/3 of the food it eats, with the rest coming from the EU, so a no-deal would limit certain types of fresh food supply and mean a return of tariffs on beef and dairy, which would push up prices. However, the government does intend to scrap most tariffs on imports, meaning food from outside the EU could be cheaper. So while seasonal foods from Europe would become pricier, you could get a bargain from further afield. Now, what about cheap clothes? Well, the bulk of our clothes come from outside the EU, from places like China and Bangladesh. But additional checks and controls in the textiles industry, checking for toxic chemicals, and all that will probably mean time delays and increased costs. What about the thing we all worry about, but it's not polite to talk about? You know, your money. Markets don't respond well to uncertainty, and the value of the pound has dramatically dropped since the referendum vote. The pound continues to drop as a no-deal Brexit becomes more and more likely, and it jumps when it becomes less likely. Now, there's a silver lining for homeowners because that means your mortgage rate could stay low for a while. A tracker rate mortgage could let you capitalise on the situation because the Bank of England will likely cut the bank rate, or at very least keep it low, to stimulate the economy. Now, what about that second home, if you want to be really ambitious? Well, if you want to buy a holiday home in the EU, the process will probably become less simple, as you'd likely need a visa or a permit to do so. Whether it's wine tasting in France or sun, sea and sand in Spain, most of us love our holidays, and last year UK residents made nearly 54 million trips to the EU. A no-deal scenario would mean an immediate end to freedom of movement, but the EU has indicated that travel will still be visa-free to the continent for us, as long as the UK does not insist on visas for European tourists in turn. If you do have European holidays planned, you would be wise to take out health insurance, as your e-hit cards and access to free healthcare will no longer exist. And if you want your pet to travel with you, you'll need to check with your vet, as there'll be no further access to the EU Pet Passport scheme and other documents will be necessary. The government was working on plans to make sure data roaming charges do not exceed £45 a month following a Brexit deal. Now, some phone providers like EE and 3 have said they will maintain free data roaming across the EU, while other operators like O2 and Vodafone have said they have no current plans to change their arrangements. However, mobile operators would be free in a no-deal to change their terms and conditions, or even remove tariff-free roaming across the EU altogether for British phone users. More than 1.3 million UK citizens currently live in other EU countries, with the most expats living in Spain. So what happens to them in case of a no-deal, or all those from the European Union who live in the UK? EU nationals who arrive in Britain before October 31st would more or less have the same rights they do now. EU citizens in the UK need to register for settled status to remain in the UK indefinitely. In the case of a no-deal, the deadline to register will be brought forward to the 31st of December 2020. For Britons living in other EU member states, in a no-deal there's some uncertainty. It's up to each individual country to decide what it wants to offer people. Most people will need to register as residents in their new countries if they aren't already, with rules and paperwork varying from member state to member state. Expats have already been advised to exchange UK driver's licenses for ones issued by the country they are living in if they want to try to stay there. A no-deal Brexit will have an immediate impact on businesses based in the UK, particularly those trading with EU member states. It would mean an end to trading on the rules set out by the biggest single market in the world. The UK would trade on WTO terms and would trade with all nations equally. That's good news for fishermen and farmers who will no longer be affected by competition rules set out by the EU. However, they could find themselves undercut by suppliers around the world. If you run your own business, the uncertainty following a no-deal would continue until the UK has negotiated agreements with the EU and other countries. Well, what about if you work in construction, academia, agriculture, healthcare, or if you employ seasonal workers? A no-deal scenario may mean the pressure is on for businesses that rely on these skill sets. One big concern for people is the things that they need but cannot really stockpile easily, like medicines. Increased customs controls could mean delays for drugs or medical ingredients at the border, and that's an issue, as almost 75% of medicines come from or via the EU. Medicines that need to be refrigerated, like insulin and some antibiotics, are then particularly vulnerable because their short shelf life means they cannot be easily stockpiled. Suppliers have built up an additional 6 weeks' worth of drugs over and above the usual buffer stockpile, with another £434 million set aside by the government to keep the inflow of medicines smooth. The government has also secured additional warehouses to stockpile medicine and say they are buying an express freight service to deliver to places where there is an urgent need. The government has warned everyone against stockpiling for their own personal supplies because it risks availability for everyone by causing panic due to worries about medicine shortage.